98. Africans arrived at Annapolis Harbor on September 29, 1767 aboard the Lord Ligonier. 42 had perished during the crossing. Among the survivors was a 17-year-old Mandinka warrior who would spend the next 55 years refusing to forget his name. The records from Spotsylvania County, Virginia, show a slave purchased that October given the name Toby. But what those records don't show, what plantation ledgers deliberately omitted, and what family Bibles refused to acknowledge was the systematic campaign to erase not just a man's identity, but the living memory of an entire culture. This is the story of how one African transformed the brutality meant to break him into a legacy that would outlast his captors. What you're about to hear has been obscured by 2 centuries of silence, and the truth is far more disturbing than anything you've been told. Before we continue with the story of the man who became known as Toby, make sure you're subscribed to Liturgy of Fear and hit that notification bell so you never miss stories like this. And we'd love to know, leave a comment telling us what state or city you're listening from right now. The details of what happened next come from sources that took nearly 200 years to surface. The Gambia River cut through West Africa like a wound that never healed, carrying British ships deeper into the continent than any other waterway on that coast. By 1767, the trading outpost on James Island had processed tens of thousands of captured Africans, but the demand from Virginia tobacco plantations had reached unprecedented levels. The wars between local kingdoms created opportunities for slave raiders, and the British Royal Africa Company paid premium prices for young men with warrior training. In the village of Ure, 2 mi from the British fort, the Kentuckian maintained their reputation as blacksmiths and holy men despite the constant threat of raids. The Mandinka people had endured for centuries by mastering the art of appearing cooperative while maintaining their traditions in secret. They taught their children to be cautious near the river, to never venture alone into the forest, and to run at the first sight of the slate African slave traders who worked for European buyers. Kunta Kinte understood these dangers better than most. As a blacksmith, he'd seen the iron shackles that bound captives for transport. He'd heard the stories of villages emptied overnight, of families torn apart and sold to different ships. He taught his eldest son the traditional skills of drum making, not just as cultural preservation, but as practical knowledge. A young man who could craft instruments might be kept alive aboard a slave ship to maintain morale among the captives. The boy's name carried weight in Mandinka tradition. Count meant complete or whole, a name given to firstborn sons who were expected to carry on the family's legacy. At 17, he'd completed his manhood training, learned to hunt with a spear, and could recite his family's lineage back 7 generations. The village elders spoke of him as someone who would one day become a respected elder himself. On a morning in early July 1767, Kunta ventured into the forest near Ure to gather wood for drum making. The specific type of hardwood he needed grew 3 mi from the village, far enough to be dangerous, but close enough that many young men made the journey regularly. He carried no weapon. Mandinka warriors didn't hunt on sacred gathering grounds, and he moved with the confidence of someone who knew these paths since childhood. What Kunta didn't know was that British Colonel O'Hare's forces had arrived at James Island 3 days earlier, bringing orders for a large shipment of slaves to fill Virginia's labor shortage. The Lord Ligonier sat anchored offshore, its captain, under pressure to fill the ship's capacity of 140 captives before the weather turned. The usual networks of African slave traders had been mobilized, paid bonuses for young males between 15 and 25 years old. 4 slates had been tracking Kunta since he left the village. They were professionals, men who'd perfected the art of ambush over dozens of successful captures. They knew to strike quickly, to overwhelm their target before any sound could alert nearby villages, and to bind captives so thoroughly that resistance became impossible. The attack happened with terrifying efficiency. The first blow came from behind, a wooden club striking Kunta's shoulder and driving him to his knees. Before he could cry out, hands clamped over his mouth while others pinned his arms. They moved with practiced coordination, binding his wrists with rope and wrapping cloth around his head to blindfold and gag him simultaneously. Within 90 seconds, Kunta went from free man to merchandise. The slatees dragged him 3 mi to a holding area near the river where 24 other captives sat chained in a temporary enclosure. Some were from Ure's neighboring villages. Others had been captured weeks earlier and transported from inland regions. All showed the same signs of shock and terror. The sudden transformation from person to property happened so quickly that the mind struggled to process it. For 3 days, Kunta remained in that holding pen while the slatees collected more captives. The conditions were deliberately brutal. Minimal food and water, exposure to the sun during the day, and cold at night. and the constant presence of guards who beat anyone who made excessive noise. The psychological impact was as calculated as the physical abuse. These men wanted captives who understood that resistance meant suffering, that cooperation was the only path to survival. When the Lord Ligonier's crew came to collect their cargo, they brought a British ship's surgeon named Dr. Thompson. His job was to inspect each captive for disease, injury, or defects that might reduce their value. The examination was methodical and dehumanizing, checking teeth, feeling muscles, examining bodies with the same attention a farmer might give to livestock. Of the 32 captives presented, he rejected 7 as unsuitable. Kunta passed the inspection. At 17 years old, he was exactly what Virginia tobacco plantations needed: young, strong, and trained in physical labor from years of blacksmith work. The British paid the slaties in rum, textiles, and iron bars, standard currency for the slave trade. Kunta became property of Captain Thomas Davies, recorded in the ship's manifest simply as male, approximately 17 years, Mandinka origin. The journey from shore to ship happened in small boats that carried 10 captives at a time. British sailors handled this transfer with practiced efficiency, knowing that this moment when captives first saw the massive ship that would carry them across the ocean often triggered desperate escape attempts. They kept everyone shackled and moved quickly. Count's first sight of the Lord Ligonier revealed the scale of what was happening. This wasn't a raid on a single village. This was an industrial operation that had been refined over decades of practice. The ship was designed specifically for human cargo, with multiple decks modified to hold as many bodies as possible in the smallest space. Other captives were already aboard, their faces visible through the cargo hold's small openings. The British crew herded the new captives below deck, where they encountered conditions that defied human comprehension. The slave deck measured approximately 5 feet high, forcing everyone to crouch or lie down. The space allocated for each person was roughly 16 in wide and 6 feet long, barely enough room to lie flat. The heat was suffocating, the air thick with sweat and fear. Wooden platforms divided the space into 2 levels, effectively doubling the number of captives that could be packed into each section. The crew chained captives together in pairs, right ankle to left ankle, making independent movement impossible. Additional chains ran along the walls, attaching to the ankle shackles and preventing anyone from reaching the stairs. The psychological impact of these restraints went beyond physical imprisonment. They made it clear that individual survival depended on the cooperation of whoever you were chained to. Counter found himself shackled to a man named Fanta, captured from a village 50 mi inland. Neither spoke the other's dialect fluently, but they shared enough common Mandinka roots to communicate basic needs. Fanta had been imprisoned for 2 weeks and understood the ship's routines. When food came, how to position your body to avoid the worst cramps, which British sailors were most likely to inflict random beatings. The Lord Ligonier remained at anchor for another week, while Captain Davies negotiated with coastal traders for additional captives. During this time, conditions below deck deteriorated rapidly. The British provided food once per day, a mixture of beans, yams, and occasionally fish served in communal buckets that 10 people shared. Water came twice daily in small rations that left everyone in a state of chronic thirst. The waste buckets quickly overflowed, and the crew's response was to hose down the deck once every 3 days, treating the captives like livestock. Disease spread with terrifying speed in these conditions. Dysentery appeared within days, causing severe dehydration and weakness. A fever swept through one section of the hold, killing 4 men in the first week. The ship's surgeon examined the sick, but made no attempt to treat them. His job was to assess whether they might recover enough to be sellable, not to provide actual medical care. On July 5, 1767, the Lord Ligonier departed Africa with 140 captives chained below deck. Captain Davies recorded in his log that he was satisfied with the cargo's quality and expected a profitable voyage. What he didn't record was the systematic brutality required to maintain control over that many desperate people trapped in nightmare conditions. The Middle Passage, the journey across the Atlantic from Africa to the Americas, typically took between 6 and 12 weeks, depending on weather conditions. The Lord Ligonier's route would carry them past the Cape Verde Islands, then southwest across the ocean's widest point before catching the trade winds toward the Caribbean and up the North American coast to Annapolis. For the captives, the voyage became an endless cycle of suffering punctuated by brief moments on deck. British policy required bringing slaves topside once per day for exercise. 30 minutes of forced movement while still shackled, ostensibly to prevent muscle atrophy, but really to reduce the death rate enough to protect profits. These moments provided the first opportunity for captives to communicate across language barriers and recognize the scale of their collective situation. Count's training as a warrior and his cultural education proved useless in this context. Everything he'd learned about courage, honor, and resistance meant nothing when you were chained in darkness with no weapon and no knowledge of where the ship was taking you. The psychological torment was methodical. Isolation from everyone who shared your language, uncertainty about your destination, and the physical weakness from minimal food and water that made clear thinking nearly impossible. But Counter noticed patterns in the British crew's behavior. The sailors who brought food were less vigilant during rough weather. The deck exercise happened at the same time each day unless storms prevented it. The ship's surgeon rarely ventured into the holes between formal inspections. These observations meant nothing in terms of immediate escape, but they indicated that the ship's operations followed routines that could potentially be exploited. Other captives made similar observations. A man named Kadi, who'd been a trader before his capture, understood some English from dealing with British merchants. He listened carefully to conversations among the crew and reported what he learned to those around him. The ship was bound for Naples, which some captives recognized as the Mandinka pronunciation of Anapapolis. They would be sold at auction to work on tobacco plantations. The British expected most of them to die within 10 years from brutal labor conditions. This information created an impossible dilemma. Several captives discussed attempting a rebellion once enough of them reached the deck simultaneously, but the shackles made coordinated action nearly impossible, and the British crew was armed with muskets and cutlasses. Any rebellion that failed would result in immediate execution of everyone involved. The risk calculation was brutal. Attempt escape and almost certainly die or accept slavery with the slim possibility of eventual freedom. Count listened to these debates but didn't participate. His father had taught him that warriors choose their battles based on realistic assessment of victory chances, not on pride or desperation. Everything about their current situation made rebellion suicidal. But he filed away every detail about the ship's routines, every weakness in the British crew's procedures, every piece of information that might prove useful later. 3 weeks into the voyage, a fever swept through the hold with devastating speed. The same conditions that made the space hellish. Extreme heat, lack of ventilation, contaminated water, inadequate sanitation created perfect breeding grounds for infectious disease. Men who'd survived capture and the journey to the ship died shackled to their partners, their bodies left in place for hours or sometimes days until the crew noticed and removed them. The ship's surgeon, Dr. Thompson, recorded each death in his log with clinical detachment. By his calculation, a 15% mortality rate was acceptable on slaving voyages. 30% required investigation. If deaths exceeded 40%, the captain would face scrutiny from the Royal Africa Company for mismanagement. The dead weren't people who'd lost their lives, they were inventory that affected profit margins. Counter's partner Fanta developed the fever during the 4th week. The early symptoms were unmistakable. Shaking chills despite the oppressive heat, severe headache, growing delirium. Fanta remained lucid enough to recognize what was happening to him, and in a moment of heartbreaking clarity, he apologized to Kunta for what would come next. Within 2 days, Fanta died and Kunta spent 18 hours chained to a corpse before the British crew noticed and removed the body. The crew didn't provide Kunta with a new partner. Instead, they shortened his ankle chain and attached it directly to the wall, giving him even less mobility than before. This isolation was unintentional. The crew simply hadn't captured enough slaves to replace all the dead, but it intensified Kunta's psychological torment. For weeks afterward, he existed in a state of near-total sensory deprivation, surrounded by suffering people, but unable to communicate meaningfully with anyone. Just when we thought we'd understood the full horror of the Middle Passage, the conditions aboard the Lord Ligonier grew even worse. The weather turned violent as the ship approached the Atlantic Center, and what happened next would test every survivor's will to live. If you're finding this story as disturbing as we are, hit that like button to support our content. Share this video with someone who should hear this history, and subscribe to Liturgy of Fear. Let's continue with the nightmare that was still unfolding. The storm struck during the 7th week at sea. Atlantic storms in late summer tested even experienced ships like the Lord Ligonier. Captain Davies had crossed this route 24 times, but every voyage brought weather that could turn deadly within hours. The first signs came at dawn: a sudden wind shift, clouds building on the western horizon, an ominous drop in atmospheric pressure that made the air feel thick and oppressive. Davies ordered the crew to secure all cargo and prepare for rough seas. For the captives chained below deck, this preparation meant absolutely nothing changed. They remained shackled in the same positions, but now the ship began to pitch and roll with increasing violence. Men who'd been lying down were suddenly thrown against their chains as the vessel lurched sideways. The wooden platforms above their heads creaked and groaned, threatening to collapse under the shifting weight. The worst part was the water. Atlantic storms drive waves over the deck, and on slave ships, that water had nowhere to go except down into the holds through the small ventilation grates. Within hours, 6 of sea eaters sloshed back and forth across the slave deck, mixing with waste from the overflowing buckets and creating a toxic soup that captives couldn't escape. The shackles kept everyone pinned in place while contaminated water washed over them repeatedly. Kunta had experienced tropical storms in Africa, but nothing prepared him for the helplessness of being chained during a maritime disaster. The ship would rise on a wave, pause at the crest, then plunge downward with enough force to lift chained bodies briefly off the wooden platforms before slamming them back down. The sounds were terrifying. Timbers groaning under stress, crew members shouting orders overhead and all around him. The cries of men convinced the ship was sinking and they would drown while shackled in the darkness. The storm lasted 4 days. During that time, the British crew made no attempt to bring food or water below deck. Maintaining their own safety took priority over preserving their cargo. The captives existed in a nightmare state of thirst, hunger, violent motion, and the constant fear that the next wave would be the one that broke the ship apart. Several men lost their minds during those 4 days, screaming continuously until their voices gave out, then continuing to scream silently with mouths open and eyes showing nothing but terror. When the weather finally cleared, Dr. Thompson descended into the holds to assess the damage. 18 more captives had died, some from injuries sustained during the violent motion, others from drinking the contaminated water out of desperate thirst, and a few from what appeared to be purely psychological collapse. The surgeon ordered the bodies removed and thrown overboard, then had the crew hosed down the slave deck without bothering to move the survivors first. The Lord Ligonier's journey illustrated the precise calculations of the transatlantic slave trade. Captain Davies had departed Africa with 140 captives. The storm deaths brought the total mortality to 42, a 30% loss rate. This was higher than Davies preferred, but still within acceptable bounds for a voyage that encountered severe weather. The Royal Africa Company would calculate profits based on the 98 survivors minus the operational costs of the voyage and determine whether Captain Davies deserved a bonus or censure. For Kunta and the other survivors, the storm's end brought no relief. The reduced number of captives meant even less incentive for the crew to maintain basic hygiene in the holds. The bodies had been removed, but the contamination remained. Disease continued to spread, now complicated by infections from the injuries people had sustained during the violent motion. The ship's surgeon provided no treatment. His job was to monitor whether slaves would survive long enough to be sold, not to actually heal them. During the 9th week at sea, something shifted in Kunta's consciousness. The psychological weight of sustained trauma, isolation, and helplessness had been gradually eroding his sense of self. He'd watched men lose their minds, seen death become so commonplace that bodies being removed no longer triggered emotional responses, and felt his own identity begin to fragment under the relentless assault on his humanity. But there was one thing his captors hadn't been able to take: his name. In Mandinka culture, names carried power. They connected you to your ancestors, defined your place in the community, and represented your essential identity. Kunta meant whole or complete, and his father had chosen it specifically to indicate that this child would grow to fulfill his destiny. As long as Kunta remembered his name, remembered the words his father had spoken during his naming ceremony, remembered the lineage that stretched back 7 generations, some core part of him remained beyond British control. Other captives near him had begun to lose their names. Under the sustained trauma of the Middle Passage, memories became unreliable. Men who'd boarded the ship knowing exactly who they were found themselves struggling to recall basic details about their previous lives. Languages blurred together. Cultural practices that had seemed eternal in Africa began to feel like half-remembered dreams. The British didn't need to actively erase these identities. The conditions they created did that work automatically. Kunta began a private ritual that would sustain him through the remaining weeks of the voyage. Each morning during the brief exercise period on deck, he would silently recite his full lineage. I am Kunta Kinte, son of Omoro Kinte, grandson of Kayaba Kunta Kinte, the holy man of the Kinte clan of Ur. He would list his father's teachings, remember specific lessons about blacksmithing and drum making, recall the taste of foods from his village. These memories became his resistance, evidence that he existed as a complete person despite British attempts to reduce him to merchandise. The Lord Ligonier sighted the North American coast during the 11th week. The appearance of land triggered visible changes in the crew's behavior. They cleaned the ship more thoroughly, made repairs to damaged equipment, and even improved the captives' food slightly. These preparations had nothing to do with humanitarian concerns and everything to do with market value. Potential buyers in Annapolis would inspect the cargo carefully, and slaves who appeared too weak or diseased would sell for reduced prices. On September 29, 1767, the ship entered Annapolis Harbor. For the captives, this moment brought an impossible mixture of emotions. The journey that had killed 42 of their companions was finally ending. But what awaited them on land was decades of slavery with no clear path to freedom. In a country whose language they didn't speak and whose customs were completely alien, the British followed a careful procedure for processing slave ships. First, the harbor master's officials would board to verify the cargo against the ship's manifest and collect customs duties. Then, the captives would be brought on deck in small groups, still shackled, for preliminary inspection by potential buyers. Only after this pre-sale viewing would the actual auction take place, usually within a week of arrival, to minimize the costs of feeding and housing the cargo. When Kunta first saw Annapolis, the contrast with Africa overwhelmed his senses. The architecture was entirely different, wooden buildings with peaked roofs instead of round mud structures with thatched covering. The climate felt alien, cooler and drier than the tropical humidity he'd known his entire life, and the people were almost entirely white with only a handful of Africans visible working along the docks. The Maryland Gazette published an advertisement on October 1, 1767. Just imported in the ship Lord Ligonier, Captain Davies from the River Gambia, a cargo of choice, healthy slaves, for sale at Annapolis on Tuesday the 7th of October. That phrase, choice, healthy slaves, represented the culmination of a commercial process that had transformed human beings into agricultural equipment. The 42 dead weren't mentioned in the advertisement. The trauma experienced by the survivors was irrelevant. What mattered to the Maryland tobacco planters was that 98 Africans were now available for purchase, ready to labor in conditions that would likely kill them within a decade. The auction itself happened at a tavern near the Annapolis docks. Potential buyers arrived to inspect the merchandise, examining teeth, checking for signs of disease, assessing physical strength. Some asked the ship's surgeon about the captives' origins, believing that certain African peoples made better workers than others. The surgeon described Kunta's group as Mandinka, generally considered suitable for agricultural labor and less prone to attempted escape than some other groups. This assessment was catastrophically wrong. But white colonists' understanding of African societies was so shallow that they treated all captured peoples as essentially interchangeable. John Waller arrived at the auction representing his family's tobacco plantation in Pennsylvania County, Virginia. The Wallers were a prominent family. John's grandfather had been a wealthy landowner, and the family maintained multiple properties worked by dozens of enslaved people. John needed several young male slaves to replace workers who'd recently died from disease or work-related injuries, and he'd brought sufficient funds to purchase 3 or 4 captives. When John examined Kunta, he saw exactly what he needed. A teenage male with visible physical strength, no obvious diseases, and the kind of compact build that suggested capability for sustained physical labor. The fact that Kunta met his eyes directly, a sign of defiance that more experienced slaveholders would have recognized, John interpreted as evidence of intelligence rather than resistance. The bidding was brief. Other planters were interested, but John offered a competitive price quickly and secured the purchase. The transaction was recorded in standard commercial terms. One Negro male, approximately 17 years old, paid in full, transferred to John Waller of Pennsylvania County. Kunta had been property of the British Crown while aboard ship. Now he was private property with John Waller holding the same legal rights over him as over any other farm equipment. The journey from Annapolis to Pennsylvania County took 3 days by wagon. John transported his new purchases in the cargo bed, still shackled, with minimal food and water. This wasn't deliberate cruelty. It was standard practice based on the widespread belief that slaves needed to understand their inferior status from the first moment. The three-day journey provided John with opportunities to communicate basic commands in English, teaching the captives words like work, stop, food, and sleep. Kunta understood nothing. The English language bore no relationship to Mandinka or any other African language he'd encountered. The sounds seemed harsh and angular, lacking the tonal qualities that made Mandinka. Words carry multiple meanings depending on pronunciation. Without any shared linguistic foundation, communication happened entirely through gesture and repetition, with violence as the primary teaching tool for compliance. The Waller plantation occupied several hundred acres along the Rappahannock River. Tobacco was the primary crop, supplemented by corn and vegetables grown for local consumption. The labor force consisted of approximately 30 enslaved people, mostly African-born, with a few second-generation slaves who'd been born on the plantation. A white overseer named Connolly managed daily operations under John Waller's general supervision, and Connie's approach to management relied heavily on intimidation and selective violence to maintain control. When Kunta arrived at the plantation, the enslaved community watched with the wary assessment of people who understood that new arrivals changed the social dynamics. Would these Africans be cooperative or defiant? Did they speak any common language with the existing workers? Were they skilled in any crafts that might earn them lighter work assignments, or would they become field hands, subject to the most brutal labor? John Waller's first order of business was renaming his new property. In his ledger, he recorded, "Negro male purchased Annapolis October 1767, given the name Toby." This renaming wasn't arbitrary. It was a deliberate step in the process of transforming a person into a slave. African names were too difficult for white people to pronounce supposedly. And more importantly, they represented cultural identity that needed to be erased. A slave named Toby had no connection to Africa, no history beyond what his owner permitted, no identity except as property. When Connolly introduced Kunta to the other slaves using this new name, pointing at him and saying Toby repeatedly, Kunta's response was immediate and instinctive. He pointed to himself and said clearly, "Kunta Kinte." Connolly interpreted this as failure to understand rather than refusal to comply, and repeated the name more slowly and loudly. "To buy Kunta Kinte," Kunta said again with the same clear insistence. In that moment, the fundamental conflict that would define the next 5 decades of his life became explicit. John Waller owned Kunta's body, controlled his labor, could sell him or beat him or work him to death. But Kunta's name, the core of his identity, remained his own. Connie's solution to this communication problem was violence. He struck Kunta across the face, then repeated the name Toby while pointing at him. Kunta responded by saying his real name again. Connolly struck him harder. Kunta, drawing on his warrior training and his father's teachings about dignity under duress, maintained eye contact and repeated count. What Connolly and John Waller failed to understand was that they were witnessing cultural values that had sustained the Mandinka people for centuries. Kunta had been taught that names carried power, that identity transcended physical circumstances, and that a man who accepted false identity lost something more essential than life itself. From Kunta's perspective, being beaten for asserting his name was painful but acceptable. Accepting a false name would mean spiritual death. This confrontation continued for 3 days. Each time someone called him Toby, Kunta would correct them with his real name. Each correction earned physical punishment, beatings, reduced food rations, isolation. The other enslaved people on the plantation watched this conflict with mixed emotions. Some admired Kunta's courage. Others saw it as foolish resistance that would bring harsher treatment for everyone. An older enslaved man named Fiddler, who'd been born in Africa but had lived in Virginia for 40 years, approached Kunta during a work break. Speaking in broken Mandinka mixed with English, Fiddler tried to explain the reality of their situation. The white men owned everything, including the ability to determine names. Resistance on this point was futile and would only bring suffering. Better to accept the name Toby publicly while maintaining your true identity privately. But Ka couldn't accept this compromise. His father had taught him that partial surrender to injustice inevitably led to complete surrender. If he accepted a false name, even in public, he would be acknowledging the white men's power to define his identity. That acknowledgement would be the first step toward becoming the property they claimed him to be, rather than a person who was being held in unjust captivity. On the 4th day, John Waller brought Kunta to the plantation's main house for what he called a lesson in obedience. The process was systematic and deliberately public. Waller had Kunta tied to a post in full view of the other slaves, then explained through Connie's translation what was about to happen. Kunta would be whipped until he accepted his new name. This wasn't punishment for specific misbehavior. It was an educational demonstration about the nature of absolute power. The whipping began with methodical precision. Connolly used a leather strap designed to cause maximum pain without inflicting injuries severe enough to reduce Count's value as a worker. After each strike, Waller asked the same question: "What is your name?" When Kunta responded, "Kunta Kinte," another blow fell. This torture continued until Kunta lost consciousness. When he revived hours later, chained in the quarters where enslaved people were housed, he found himself surrounded by other Africans who'd been watching the entire demonstration. Their faces showed a mixture of sympathy, fear, and resignation. They'd all been through similar lessons when they first arrived. They'd all learned that resistance led to suffering with no possibility of victory. But they'd also noticed something that John Waller and Connolly had missed. Despite the beating, Kunta had never once said the name Toby. He'd lost consciousness from pain before surrendering his identity, and that fact resonated with people who'd been forced to compromise themselves in countless ways just to survive. The next morning, still injured from the whipping, Kunta was assigned to tobacco field work under Connie's direct supervision. Clears throat. Tobacco cultivation in 1767. Virginia was brutally labor-intensive. The process required planting seedlings by hand, constant weeding, removing tobacco worms, topping the plants at the correct growth stage, harvesting leaves as they ripened, and hanging them in curing barns. Each step was time-sensitive and required knowledge that Kunta didn't have. Connie's teaching method consisted of demonstrating an action once, then beating anyone who failed to replicate it correctly. By this logic, a slave who didn't understand English should learn quickly through pain association. The reality was that Kunta spent his first weeks in constant confusion, never quite certain what was expected, always one step behind the other workers, who'd had years to learn the routines. But Kunta possessed something that his captors didn't recognize: the observational skills his father had taught him during blacksmith training. A good blacksmith learned by watching subtle details: how metal changed color at different temperatures, which hammer blows achieved specific effects, how the sound of striking metal indicated its readiness for shaping. Kunta applied those same skills to learning plantation operations, watching not just what people did, but the precise sequence and timing of their actions. Within 2 weeks, Kunta had mastered basic tobacco field work well enough to avoid most beatings. He still didn't understand English commands, but he'd learned to read the situation, watching what other workers did, and replicating their actions, anticipating what Connolly would demand based on the time of day and stage of tobacco growth, keeping his head down and his movements steady to avoid drawing attention. The other enslaved people began to recognize that this African newcomer was different. Most recently arrived captives existed in a state of psychological shock for months, moving through their work like automatons, barely aware of their surroundings. Kunta was clearly traumatized. His eyes showed the same thousand-year stare that everyone developed after experiencing Middle Passage horror, but he remained alert and engaged in a way that suggested his mind hadn't been broken. This psychological resilience came from the same source as his refusal to accept a false name: his father's teachings about maintaining dignity under oppression. Omoro had lived his entire life to me from a British slave fort. He'd raised his children with the explicit understanding that their freedom was fragile and could be stolen at any moment. But he'd also taught them that inner identity, the knowledge of who you really were, could never be taken unless you surrendered it willingly. The weeks turned into months, and a routine emerged. Kunta worked in the tobacco fields from dawn to dusk, ate the minimal rations provided to enslaved workers, slept in the crowded quarters, and endured the casual violence that characterized plantation life. John Waller occasionally tested whether the whipping had been effective, calling Kunta Toby and watching for his response. Each time, Kunta would either remain silent or quietly correct with his real name, earning a cuff across the head, but never the severe beating that might reduce his ability to work. Waller found this behavior puzzling, but not particularly concerning. Some slaves took longer to break than others. As long as Ka did his work adequately and didn't actively rebel, his refusal to accept his slave name was an annoyance rather than a serious problem. Waller assumed that time and sustained exposure to plantation reality would eventually wear down any resistance. What Waller didn't recognize was that every day count maintained his name. He won a small victory against the system designed to destroy him, and other enslaved people on the plantation noticed those victories. They saw an African who'd survived the Middle Passage horror, endured whippings for refusing to surrender his identity, and somehow maintained his essential self despite everything slavery inflicted on him. As winter approached in late 1767, Kunta had been enslaved for 6 months, captured in July, transported across the Atlantic, sold in October, and worked through the tobacco harvest season. In Mandinka culture, he should have been celebrating his 18th birthday, taking on adult responsibilities in his village, perhaps being considered for marriage. Instead, he was property in a foreign country, doing agricultural work he'd never trained for, unable to communicate in the local language and surrounded by people who'd been so thoroughly broken by slavery that most had forgotten resistance was even possible. But Kunta hadn't forgotten, and that fact would make what happened next both inevitable and terrifying. The story of Toby, the slave who refused his name, was about to take a turn that would shock even the hardened overseers of Spotsylvania County. But first, we need you to do something. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens when a man chooses freedom over survival. Winter's arrival brought new horrors no one anticipated. Virginia winters in the late 1760s were harsh by the standards of someone raised in tropical West Africa. Temperatures dropped below freezing regularly, and the enslaved workers' quarters provided minimal protection from the cold. The Waller Plantation, like most Virginia tobacco operations, didn't invest in adequate winter housing for slaves. The logic being that warm buildings cost money, while slaves who died from cold exposure could be replaced through purchase. Kunta's first Virginia winter introduced him to physical suffering distinct from the tropical diseases he'd known in Africa. Frostbite damaged his fingers during morning work when the ground was frozen solid. Respiratory infections spread through the quarters with deadly efficiency. Close quarters, poor ventilation, and inadequate clothing created perfect conditions for contagious illness. Several slaves died during that first winter, their bodies buried in unmarked graves at the edge of the plantation property. During this season, Kunta made his first escape attempt. The idea had been forming since his arrival. Every day at the plantation reinforced his understanding that this situation was temporary, not because anyone would free him, but because death from overwork, disease, or punishment would eventually end his suffering. The only question was whether he would die as property or die while attempting to reclaim freedom. Kunta's knowledge of North American geography was essentially non-zero. He understood that he'd been transported across a large body of water, which meant Africa lay in some direction across the ocean. He'd observed that the sun rose and set in patterns similar to Africa, suggesting similar latitude. But beyond these basic observations, he had no map, no knowledge of distances, no understanding of the landscape he'd need to cross. His plan was remarkably simple: escape during the night, travel away from the plantation in whatever direction seemed least populated, and either find a way back to the coast or locate other Africans who might have established free communities. This plan had virtually no chance of success. But Kunta understood that success wasn't the only measure of meaningful action. Sometimes resistance had value, even when it was futile. The escape happened in January 1768 during a week when Connolly was away visiting family in Fredericksburg. The remaining white supervisor was less vigilant about evening headcounts, and Kunta had noticed a pattern. If all slaves appeared to be present during the initial evening check, no one verified later in the night. The winter cold meant everyone stayed inside the quarters as much as possible, so unusual movements were less likely to be noticed. Kunta waited until approximately midnight, then quietly exited the quarters through a rear door whose lock had been damaged for weeks. He moved carefully, knowing that dogs might be loose on the property, and that several white families lived within half a mile of the Waller plantation. His clothing consisted of the minimal rags provided to field workers, entirely inadequate for winter weather, but the only option available. For the first 3 mi, everything went according to Kunta's limited plan. He followed a creek bed heading roughly north, reasoning that waterways might eventually lead to larger rivers and ultimately the ocean. The physical challenge was immediate. His feet, inadequately protected by crude shoes made from scraps, began to suffer from the cold within an hour. The winter landscape was utterly alien, nothing like the African forest he'd known. Near dawn, Kunta heard dogs barking in the distance behind him. The sound triggered an immediate understanding. The plantation had discovered his absence, and professional slave catchers were already pursuing him. These weren't random farm dogs. They were tracking hounds trained specifically to hunt escaped slaves capable of following a scent trail for miles. What happened next illustrated the ruthless efficiency of the 18th century Virginia slave catching system. Connolly had returned earlier than expected and noticed Kunta's absence during the morning work call. He immediately contacted Thomas Matthews, a professional slave catcher who operated throughout Spotsylvania County. Matthews maintained a team of trained dogs and several assistants who specialized in tracking and recovering escaped slaves. Matthews' approach to slave catching was methodical. He started at the point of escape, let his dogs pick up the scent, and then followed at a steady pace that allowed the dogs to do most of the work. His payment structure was simple. He received a flat fee for successful recovery, plus expenses. If the escaped slave resisted violently, Matthews was authorized to use whatever force necessary to ensure compliance, provided the slave survived in condition to continue working. Kunta had covered perhaps 8 missiles when the dogs caught up to him. The confrontation happened in a clearing where the terrain offered no defensive advantages. Matthews' assistants surrounded him while the dogs created a barrier that made escape impossible. Through gestures and broken English, Matthews indicated that Kunta should return voluntarily. When Kunta didn't immediately comply, not from defiance but from incomplete understanding, Matthews ordered his assistants to restrain him forcibly. They bound Kunta's hands and attached a rope around his neck, then began the 8-mile walk back to the Waller plantation. Matthews followed his standard practice of parading captured slaves along main roads during daylight hours. This public display served multiple purposes. It reminded enslaved people throughout the county that escape was futile. It advertised Matthews' services to plantation owners, and it reinforced white communities' sense of control over the black population. When they arrived at the Waller plantation, Connolly and John Waller were waiting. The next hours would be recorded in detail in the memories of every enslaved person who witnessed what happened. Not because it was unusual for slave catchers to punish captured runaways, but because of what Count's response revealed about the limits of human endurance. John Waller had Kunta tied to the same post where he'd been whipped for refusing his slave name. But this punishment served a different purpose. The name whipping had been about establishing authority. This beating was about terror, creating an example so brutal that no other slave would consider escape. Connolly administered the whipping with professional efficiency, striking Count's back in patterns designed to maximize pain without causing life-threatening injuries. Between each set of strikes, Waller asked variations of the same question. "Will you run again?" The expected response was immediate denial and begging for mercy. The reality was that Kunta, drawing on reserves of strength that defied rational explanation, remained largely silent throughout the beating. This silence disturbed Waller more than screaming would have. A slave who screamed and begged showed he understood his powerlessness and could be broken. A slave who endured torture silently possessed some inner resistance that whipping couldn't reach. After 30 strikes, enough to leave Kunta's back a mass of bleeding wounds. Waller stopped the beating and ordered Kunta to be confined in a storage shed for a week with minimal food and water. The weekend isolation gave Kunta time to assess the consequences of his escape attempt. The physical pain was severe but manageable. He'd experienced similar injuries during warrior training in Africa, and the human body's capacity to tolerate pain was greater than most people realized. What concerned him more was the strategic failure of his escape. 8 me in 12 hours was pathetically inadequate. The tracking dogs had found him easily, and he'd learned nothing about the geography between the plantation and potential freedom. But the escape had also revealed something important about the plantation system. It relied on terror and surveillance rather than physical barriers. There were no walls around the Waller property, no guards posted at the boundaries. The prison was psychological. The slaves' knowledge that escape meant being hunted by dogs and returned for brutal punishment. Kunta began to consider whether future escape attempts needed different planning. Rather than fleeing immediately without preparation, perhaps he needed to learn English, gather information about the landscape, identify potential allies, and wait for the right moment. This calculation required patience that his warrior training hadn't developed, but it also acknowledged the reality that impulsive escape attempts accomplished nothing except demonstrating defiance. When Kunta returned to fieldwork after his week of confinement, the other enslaved people treated him with a mixture of respect and concern. No one discussed the escape attempt directly. Talking about resistance near white people was suicidally dangerous. But Kunta noticed subtle changes in how people interacted with him. Fiddler began teaching him English more actively, providing vocabulary that might prove useful for survival. Other workers shared small amounts of their food rations, recognizing that Counter was being systematically underfed as continued punishment. These small gestures of solidarity created bonds that John Waller and Connolly never recognized. From the white perspective, the plantation's enslaved population consisted of separate individuals competing for slightly better treatment. The reality was that trauma and oppression created powerful connections among people who understood that survival required cooperation. As spring arrived in 1768, Kunta had been enslaved for 10 months. His English had improved enough to understand basic commands and communicate simple ideas. He'd learned the tobacco cultivation cycle well enough to avoid most beatings, and he'd begun to recognize that the Waller plantation existed within a larger system of slavery that extended throughout Virginia and beyond. This understanding came primarily from conversations with Fiddler, who'd lived in Virginia long enough to develop a comprehensive picture of colonial slavery's scope. There were hundreds of plantations in Spotsylvania County alone. Thousands more spread throughout Virginia. The entire regional economy depended on enslaved labor, tobacco, corn, wheat, livestock. White Virginians had created a society where enslaved Africans outnumbered white colonists in many counties. Yet they maintained control through systematic terror and the legal authority to inflict unlimited violence on black bodies. Fiddler also explained something that Kunta found initially incomprehensible. There were enslaved people who'd never seen Africa, who'd been born on Virginia plantations to parents who were themselves born into slavery. These second- and third-generation slaves grew up speaking English, practicing Christianity, and having no direct memory of African culture. From the white perspective, these people were ideal slaves. They had no alternative cultural framework and could be more easily controlled than African-born captives. This information forced Count to confront a disturbing possibility. Slavery wasn't a temporary condition that would end when enough Africans rebelled or when white colonists recognized the injustice. It was a permanent system designed to reproduce itself across generations. The children of enslaved people became property of their parents' owners. Freedom had no obvious path. In May 1768, Kunta made his second escape attempt. This effort showed slightly more planning than the first. He'd stolen food scraps over several weeks, hidden them in the quarters, and identified a route that followed established roads rather than random wilderness paths. His English was now adequate for basic misdirection. If questioned by white travelers, he could claim to be on an errand for his master, buying himself hours before anyone became suspicious. The escape lasted 3 days before Matthew's dogs found him hiding in a barn approximately 20 millimeters from the Waller plantation. The recapture followed the same pattern as before. Matthews and his assistants surrounded him, bound him, and paraded him back along public roads as a warning to other potential escapees. John Waller's response was more severe this time. Kunta had demonstrated that standard punishment wasn't deterring his escape attempts. Waller needed to escalate to a level of consequence that would make further resistance psychologically impossible. The method Waller chose, cutting off half of Kunta's right foot, was standard practice in colonial Virginia for dealing with persistent escape attempts. The logic was coldly practical. A slave who couldn't run away effectively retained most of his agricultural labor value while losing his mobility. Plantation owners throughout the South used this particular mutilation frequently enough that there were established procedures for minimizing infection risk and recovery time. Dr. William Waller, John's brother and a trained physician, performed the amputation. The procedure happened in the plantation's tool shed with Count tied down and several white men holding him still. No anesthetic was provided, the expense wasn't justified for slave punishment, and the pain was considered part of the deterrent effect. What the historical records don't adequately capture is the psychological impact of this mutilation. From John Waller's perspective, he was modifying property to prevent future loss. No different than branding cattle or clipping a horse's tendons to prevent bolting. From Kunta's perspective, he was experiencing state-sanctioned torture inflicted by someone who believed he had the moral and legal right to permanently maim another human being. The amputation achieved its intended physical effect. Count would never again be able to run effectively, which meant future escape attempts would face insurmountable practical obstacles. But it had an unintended consequence. It transformed Count from an anonymous field slave into someone whose story other enslaved people remembered and repeated. Stories about the African who tried to escape twice despite knowing the consequences, who'd endured mutilation rather than submit completely to slavery, who maintained his real name despite years of punishment. These narratives spread through the informal communication networks that connected enslaved communities throughout Virginia. Kunta became a symbol of resistance, not because his resistance was successful, but because it continued despite absolutely overwhelming odds. During his recovery from the amputation, confined to the quarters and unable to work, Kunta had extended conversations with Fiddler and other longtime slaves. These discussions revealed aspects of plantation life he hadn't previously understood. The other enslaved people had developed sophisticated strategies for preserving dignity and humanity despite their circumstances. They maintained secret family connections across different plantations. They practiced African religious traditions in hidden gatherings. They taught their children about freedom even when freedom seemed impossible. These conversations also revealed the complexity of survival under slavery. Some people had chosen cooperation with plantation authorities, serving as foremen or house servants, trading minor privileges for enforcing discipline among field workers. Others had embraced Christianity, finding in the religion a framework for understanding suffering and maintaining hope for eventual justice. Still others had developed psychological mechanisms that allowed them to function despite trauma, compartmentalizing their sense of self, performing obedience while maintaining private resistance. Kunta listened to these stories and recognized that his absolutist approach, refusing his slave name, attempting escape despite impossible odds, represented only one strategy among many. Other people's choices weren't cowardice or collaboration. They were different answers to the same impossible question. How do you maintain humanity when a system is designed to destroy it? When Kunta returned to work after his injury healed, his assigned tasks changed. With limited mobility from the amputation, he couldn't keep up with fieldwork that required constant movement. Instead, Dr. William Waller, who'd purchased Kunta from his brother after the amputation, assigned him to garden maintenance and eventually to driving the buggy that transported the Waller family around the county. This role change brought Kunta into closer contact with the Waller household and provided insights into white colonial society he hadn't had as a field worker. He observed the Wallers' daily routines, their social relationships with other plantation families, their religious practices, and their casual discussions about slavery as if it were no more morally complicated than livestock management. These observations forced Kunta to confront a disturbing truth. The white people who enslaved him weren't monsters in the simple sense. They were ordinary people who'd been raised in a society that normalized absolute power over black bodies. They attended church, celebrated holidays, expressed love for their families, and genuinely believed they were moral beings while simultaneously owning human beings and treating them as agricultural equipment. This realization didn't create sympathy. Kunta understood that normalized evil was still evil, but it clarified the magnitude of what he was fighting against. Slavery wasn't maintained by a few cruel individuals who could be removed or persuaded. It was woven into the entire social structure of colonial Virginia, supported by law, religion, economics, and cultural assumptions that most white people never questioned. As the years passed, 1769, 1770, 1771, Kunta's role on the Waller plantation became increasingly complex. He learned English fluently, which allowed him to understand the full scope of what slavery meant in Virginia. He observed the plantation's operations closely, recognizing the economic calculations that determined every aspect of enslaved life, and he began to recognize that his resistance had taken a different form than he'd originally imagined. He couldn't escape. The amputation had made that physically impossible, and he couldn't fight. One man against an entire system backed by legal authority and unlimited violence had no chance. But he could maintain his identity, preserve his cultural knowledge, and pass that legacy to others. His name remained Kunta Kinte regardless of what the Wallers called him. His identity as a Mandinka warrior remained intact despite his enslaved status. During this period, Kunta developed a relationship with an enslaved woman named Belle, who worked as the Waller household's cook. Belle had been born in Virginia to African parents, and her life experience bridged the gap between African cultural memory and American enslavement. She spoke English as her primary language, but remembered African words her parents had taught her. She practiced a hybrid religion that combined Christianity with African spiritual traditions, and she developed survival strategies that balanced cooperation with the Wallers against maintaining private resistance. Their relationship grew slowly over months of conversation in the plantation kitchen where Kunta would wait while Dr. Waller conducted business inside the house. Belle recognized in Kunta something she'd rarely seen. An African-born person who'd maintained his essential identity despite years of brutal attempts to break him. Kunta recognized in Belle someone who'd found ways to preserve humanity in circumstances designed to destroy it. In 1772, Belle became pregnant with Kunta's child. This pregnancy represented a moment of profound significance for Kunta. In Mandinka culture, having children meant continuing your family line, passing on cultural knowledge and ensuring that your identity would survive beyond your death. Under slavery, having children meant bringing a new person into bondage, watching your daughter or son become property, and knowing they would suffer the same trauma you'd experienced. Belle's daughter, whom Kunta insisted on naming Kizzy, a Mandinka word meaning you stay put, was born in 1773. Kunta approached fatherhood with the same determination he'd brought to maintaining his name. He would teach Kizzy African words, tell her stories about her grandfather, Kunta Kinte, and ensure she knew that her real heritage extended beyond the plantation where she was born as property. This teaching happened in secret during moments when no white people were present to observe. Kunta would hold his infant daughter and speak to her in Mandinka, describing the village of Ur that she would never see. He would recount his family lineage, ensuring that even if Kai grew up enslaved, she would know that her ancestors had been free people with culture, history, and dignity. Belle watched these interactions with mixed emotions. She understood Kunta's desire to pass on his heritage, but she also recognized the danger. If the Wallers discovered that Kunta was teaching Kai African culture, they might sell the child to another plantation as punishment. Belle had already lost 2 infant children to such sales, and the trauma of those losses never fully healed. The tension between preserving cultural identity and protecting children from the worst consequences of slavery would define Kizzy's childhood. Kunta wanted her to remember Africa and maintain resistance. Belle wanted her to learn English perfectly, practice Christianity publicly, and develop skills that might earn her slightly better treatment within the plantation system. Both approaches came from love and from traumatic experience with slavery's brutal realities. As Kizzy grew from infant to child, Kunta taught her a vocabulary of African words: cow, river, harvest, guitar. These words had no practical use in Virginia, but they represented connections to a world beyond slavery. When Kizzy pointed to a river and said, Kambi Balongo, the Mandinka name for the Gambia River, she was speaking a language her enslavers couldn't understand and maintaining a cultural tradition they couldn't erase. In 1780, when Kai was 7 years old, something happened that would test everything Kunta had tried to teach her about identity and resistance. Missy Ann, the niece of Dr. William Waller, began visiting the plantation regularly and developed a friendship with Kai. Missy Ann was roughly the same age as Kai, and in the innocent way that children sometimes can. She saw Kai as a playmate rather than property. This friendship created a complicated situation. Miss Ann began teaching Kai to read and write, skills that were illegal for enslaved people to possess in Virginia. The law prohibited slave literacy specifically because educated slaves posed a greater escape risk and might forge traveling papers. But Miss Ann, operating from a child's limited understanding of slavery's implications, simply wanted to share her knowledge with her friend. Kunta and Belle faced an impossible decision. If they forbade Kizzy from learning to read, they would protect her from potential consequences if her literacy was discovered. But they would also prevent her from gaining knowledge that might someday prove useful. If they allowed the lessons to continue secretly, they risked catastrophic punishment if the Wallers learned about it. They chose to let Kai learn with stern warnings to never reveal her literacy to any white person except Miss Ann. This decision would have devastating consequences. By 1785, Key had reached her teenage years. She'd grown into a young woman who embodied all the contradictions of her position: American-born but raised with African cultural knowledge, enslaved but literate, aware of the plantation system's brutality, but never having experienced the Middle Passage horror her father endured. Her relationship with Miss Ann had continued, creating bonds of genuine affection that somehow coexisted with the fundamental inequality of their positions. During this time, a young enslaved man named Noah arrived at a neighboring plantation. Noah had been born in Virginia and was close to Kai's age. The two developed a relationship during church gatherings where enslaved people from multiple plantations were permitted to attend services together. This relationship, conducted under constant surveillance and with no privacy, represented the full complexity of love under slavery. Genuine human connection existing within a system designed to prevent it. In 1786, Noah decided to escape. His plan was to reach Pennsylvania, which had begun gradual emancipation, and then somehow return to help Kai escape as well. This plan had virtually no chance of success. But Noah was young enough to believe that love could overcome systemic oppression. He asked Kizzy to write him a traveling pass, a document claiming he had permission from his master to travel for specific business purposes. Such passes were routine for enslaved people who had errands requiring travel between properties. Kizzy's secret literacy made her one of the few enslaved people capable of creating a convincing forgery. Kizzy understood the catastrophic risk. Writing a forged traveling pass wasn't just forbidden, it was a serious crime that would result in brutal punishment and likely sailed to another plantation. But Noah argued that without the pass, his escape attempt had no chance. While with it, he might actually reach freedom. And Kizzy, at 16 years old and in love, made the choice to help him despite knowing the potential consequences. Noah's escape attempt failed within 2 days. Slave catchers found the forged pass in his possession and traced the handwriting to Kai. When Dr. William Waller learned that his enslaved cook's daughter could read and write and had used that literacy to assist an escape attempt, his response was immediate and unforgiving. Kizzy was sold to a trader who specialized in transporting slaves to plantations in North Carolina. The sale happened within 24 hours of the discovery, specifically to prevent Belle and Ka from attempting any intervention. One day, Kai was living with her parents on the Walla plantation. The next day, she was property of a stranger, being transported several hundred miles away with no possibility of contact with her family. For Count and Belle, this loss represented the culmination of every nightmare slavery had threatened. They'd raised a daughter, taught her about dignity and identity, and watched her grow into a young woman capable of remarkable courage. And then the system they'd been fighting against for decades demonstrated its ultimate power. It could take their child, and they were legally powerless to stop it. Count's response to this loss would define the final decades of his life. He'd endured capture in Africa, survived the Middle Passage, withstood repeated beatings, maintained his identity despite constant pressure, and even accepted the amputation of his foot rather than completely submit to slavery. But losing Kai to a forced sale broke something in him that previous trauma hadn't touched. The historical records show that after Kizzy's sale, Kunta became increasingly withdrawn. He continued his work as Dr. Waller's buggy driver, maintained his dignity, and never forgot his name. But friends among the enslaved community noticed changes. Longer periods of silence, less engagement with the small resistances that had characterized his earlier years, a kind of resigned acceptance that the system he'd been fighting would ultimately win. This psychological shift wasn't surrender in the simple sense. Count never accepted that slavery was justified or that he deserved his status, but he'd learned through unbearable experience that maintaining identity and resisting oppression didn't prevent the system from inflicting the worst possible suffering, losing your children to a commercial transaction. The years continued with grim inevitability. Kunta worked, aged, and watched as the plantation system refined itself. Virginia's tobacco economy expanded. More Africans arrived through the slave trade. Second and third generation enslaved people grew up knowing no other life, and the white colonial society that depended on this system developed increasingly elaborate justifications for why enslaved people deserved their status. In 1810, Belle died from complications of pneumonia, one of many diseases that spread through enslaved quarters due to inadequate housing and medical care. Kunta continued working for another 12 years until age and accumulated injuries made even light labor impossible. In 1822, at approximately 70 years old, Kunta Kinte died on the Waller plantation, still enslaved, never having returned to Africa or gained his freedom. The plantation records show his death recorded as Toby, age approximately 70, died of natural causes. No mention of Africa, no acknowledgement of the Middle Passage, no recognition of the 2 escape attempts or the amputation that resulted, just a brief note documenting that property had been lost and needed to be replaced. But in the memory of enslaved people throughout Virginia, and eventually throughout the South, Kunta's story survived. Parents told their children about the African who refused to accept his slave name. Communities remembered the man who tried to escape even after his foot was cut off. And those stories became part of a larger oral tradition that preserved African cultural memory despite slavery's systematic attempts to erase it. Kizzy, sold to Thomas Lee's plantation in North Carolina, survived into the 1850s. She bore a son named George, conceived through rape by her enslaver, who became known as Chicken George due to his assigned duties managing cockfighting birds. George would eventually gain his freedom, and his children would live to see slavery's legal end in 1865. Through 7 generations, Kunta Kinte's name and story were passed down through oral tradition, surviving when written records were destroyed or never created. In the 1960s, a descendant named Alex Haley began researching his family history, tracing connections back through documents, census records, and eventually to Jure in Gambia, where oral historians called griots remembered stories about a young man named Kunta, who was captured around 1767 and never seen again. The book Haley published, Roots, The Saga of an American Family, would introduce Kunta Kinte's story to millions of readers worldwide. It would spark renewed interest in African American genealogy, force conversations about slavery's lasting impact, and help establish that enslaved people weren't just victims, but individuals who'd maintained identity and resistance despite overwhelming oppression. But the core of that story, the truth that America never wanted confronted, wasn't about eventual triumph or redemption. It was about a 17-year-old African warrior who was captured, transported across the ocean, and enslaved for 55 years, who tried to escape twice and lost part of his foot as punishment, who taught his daughter about freedom she would never experience, who maintained his name and identity despite systematic attempts to erase both, and who ultimately died as property on the same plantation where he'd spent most of his enslaved life. The horror of Kunta Kinte's story isn't that it was exceptional, it's that it was ordinary. Hundreds of thousands of Africans experienced similar trauma during the transatlantic slave trade. Millions of enslaved people lived and died under similar conditions. The system that destroyed Kunta Kinte's freedom operated legally with religious sanction and with widespread support throughout colonial and early American society for nearly 3 centuries. What makes Kunta Kinte's story significant isn't that he successfully rebelled or escaped or found freedom. It's that despite everything slavery inflicted on him, he never forgot who he was. His name remained Kunta. His identity as a Mandinka warrior remained intact, and he passed that knowledge to his daughter, who passed it to her son, who passed it through generations until it reached the present day. That continuity, the preservation of identity across centuries of trauma, represents a form of resistance that slavery's architects never fully defeated. They could enslave bodies, control labor, inflict unlimited violence, and separate families through forced sales. But they couldn't completely erase the knowledge that enslaved people had been whole human beings before capture, that they possessed cultures and histories that predated slavery, and that their identities transcended the property status white society imposed on them. This story shows us something essential about the American experience. This nation was built on a foundation of systematic brutality that treated human beings as agricultural equipment. The tobacco, cotton, sugar, and rice that drove economic development came from enslaved labor under conditions so horrific that describing them fully remains difficult 2 centuries later. And the legal, religious, and cultural systems that white Americans created to justify this brutality continue to shape American society long after slavery's formal end. Kunta's legacy isn't comfortable or redemptive. It's a reminder of what was stolen, what was survived, and what can never be fully repaired. His story forces confrontation with historical truth that many would prefer to forget. That the country proclaiming all men are created equal simultaneously operated the largest slavery system in the Western Hemisphere, and that the effects of that contradiction echo through generations. So, what do you think of this story? Does knowing the full truth about slavery's reality change how you understand American history? Do you believe a person who maintained his identity despite everything has achieved a kind of victory? Or is that just romanticizing unbearable suffering? Leave your thoughts in the comments below, and let's have a real conversation about why these stories still matter. If this history gave you chills, hit that subscribe button and notification bell so you never miss stories like this. Share this video with someone who needs to understand what really happened during America's slavery era. And remember, this isn't ancient history. The last person born into slavery died in the 1970s. These events are shockingly recent, and their effects are still with us. Thanks for watching Liturgy of Fear. See you in the next video. 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 You in the next